and welcome to The Sun and the Moon. My name's Alexandria Irons, and I'm here today with my co-host, Luna.
Hey, I'm Luna all day. You have to forgive me. I'm a little sick today, so I'm a little raspy, but I'm really excited that we have Murphy on the show today. A very, very talented and educated or knowledgeable professional in the cannabis industry doing a lot of extraction work with cannabis and with mushrooms. I'm super excited to dive into some really cool concepts with you.
Definitely. Thanks for having me, you guys.
Yeah, for sure.
So, were you at Mycelium this past weekend?
I didn't go this year. I went last year. This year it was going to be, especially with the ferry and stuff, I couldn't really like pop in and out for a day like I was hoping. And so I didn't get to go and spend the weekend. But hopefully next year the school schedule will work out better. If it was like 1 week later, my son would have been out of school for the weekend. It would have been perfect, but next year for sure. Did you go?
I didn't go this year. We actually had a death in our family, so unfortunately, just life. But I was there last year, and I saw you speak, and I was just super interested in everything that you have going on, especially with the mushroom extraction. It's just so cool seeing how that industry is blowing up and blooming, and what you can apply from cannabis industry into the mushroom extraction. You know, it's all applicable and really cool.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if anything, it's comforting because it's like, you know, we don't have to really reinvent very much. We just have to go exploring, and it's a lot more fun with mushrooms because there's still so much unknown. So there's not a whole lot of like, my way is the best yet, you know?
Murphy, why don't you tell everyone like exactly what you do for maybe people who don't know who you are, and like the processes that you play with, and like just what you're all about.
Sure. So I've been working in the cannabis industry for, quite a long time. 2009 is when I started out, and, I started out doing just bubble hash like everyone, and back then it was like full melt clear dome, like we were collecting trichome heads, very, very rudimentary, but like classic, still fire today. From there, I got into, chemical extraction, especially as licensing came into play. And with licensing came higher costs and therefore outside funding. And so the more money you spend, the more cool shit you can do. And through that evolution, we started to see cannabis testing arrive on the scene. When I first started working in this industry, everyone was doing their potency tests with gas chromatography. So everyone was getting Delta 9 tests, which is not what you're growing, right? Like there's a whole other profile, a whole other molecule that's on the plant. And so, the way we tested determined a lot about the way we extracted, the way we infused, because we can only work with that, type of information, in the context we were given. And that's one of the biggest parallels that I see with the mushroom extraction right now is that, we had people making mushroom extracts like the blue juice or the lemon tech or whatever at home for a long time, but the testing wasn't there to back that up. And so, for the previous decades and decades and decades of mushroom consumption, the people who were extracting weren't talking about it like it's a sophisticated extract because we didn't have the data to demonstrate that we went from 5 to 20 or whatever, in our potency. And that's the area where as soon as mushroom legalization started showing up in, in Oakland, in Denver, now in the whole state of Colorado and in Oregon as well, like I knew that was our limitation. Once we started having HPLC testing and we could look at potency quickly and for cheap, like that was the important part. Okay. In terms of improving like what we were doing and how we were doing it, every decision that we made before testing was like a guess or like a tip from a friend, it wasn't supported by data. And the same is very much true in the mushroom world. You've got people who will, like you see the nutrient kind of conversation happening in the substrate world. And none of that is being backed up with data to support that potency, or data to support the sugar content or the reduced moisture content even. Most people aren't even, accurately telling you how many days, are they saving time. And so like we lose all those data points. And so, I've got an HPLC at home here, and, the testing on the psychedelic drugs is where I've been, spending a lot of my extra time and attention, because that's what informs everything that comes next. All of the methods that I'm using when I'm looking at fungi are borrowed from other things that have worked, or are based on, the analytical data as it develops. And that part is wild, because it does just change, overnight. 2 years ago, we weren't testing for more than psilocybin and psilocin. And now everyone's got 5 tryptamines minimum. It's a big difference. And it's just going to keep expanding into other categories, which is exciting, because it's like, it's proof that we can do it, that like, once you give us the data, we can get better. But I also know, like, that's our limitation. When I look at cannabis, like, our ability to accurately test the flavor profile of a cannabis plant is just trash. Like, we are not even trying. Everyone talks about terps. Nobody tests for terps. And part of the reason nobody tests for terps is because it's not exactly the information we're looking for. It's not enough.
Right. Okay. Like
And
the other volatile compounds.
Yeah. Well, other categories of compounds, and also just how they work together. Like, it was a long time before we really understood that a large quantity of CBN made a difference when you were consuming an extract, and until we figured that out, more was more. We didn't look at it as more could be different. More was just more. And the same thing, I think, is going to be really important with some of the psychedelics, because the difference between hungry and sleepy when I smoke a joint is only so much, but the difference between overly emotional or overly visually stimulated is a lot if I'm like a microdosing mom,
Right. Yeah.
who like, versus. And so, there's a lot of, kind of responsibility in that data, but there's not a whole lot of accountability for it, because the consumers don't ask, or they don't say, hey, I don't understand that, or like, how does this affect me? Like, no
Right.
consumers use the limonene content to make their flower choice.
Sometimes.
Well, you know what?
Sometimes.
It's why we're having the conversation now, right here. Having the education out there and available to consumers is so important, because I mean, it's like you're saying that people aren't testing for terpenes. I guess I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I know that most people, like home growers, aren't, but like in California, it seems like they're putting a lot of terpene testing. I know that there's way more volatile organic compounds that are influencing the entourage effect and flavor, but I think just having the conversation and letting people know, like, higher THC doesn't mean higher, or what is it you're looking for? What is that end effect? And it's going to be influenced by all of these things. And it's, I mean, you pointing out the whole, the entourage effect of mushrooms, and I'm also a microdosing mom, so I am so wary. Like, I'm like, no, you can't be tripping, like, with the child around. It's completely different. And as we're seeing the medicinal benefits of it, like, it's completely changed my life, getting through postpartum depression, helping with so many things. And it's, there is so much in humanity responsible, like, from psychedelics, and that has been taken away from us. That's our human rights as a sovereign individual to have that experience with nature. So this is just amazing. I'm so happy that we're here having this conversation so that we can educate people and get consumers to ask these questions. Hey, what is it? What am I what are these test results? What do they even mean? So what, as you are, like, data is super important to you, what would you advise people to look for if you were, like, talking to a newbie here who's just like, what do you want? What do you want to see on those test results? What should be a requirement of everyone?
I think the first thing you want to pay attention to on any COA is the date. when was that sample delivered to the lab and when was that COA produced? And then compare that to today. I was listening to one of your past episodes, and I think it was Luna who said, that potentially one of the reasons people shut off the lights is to cut down on that terpene evaporation, because those terps aren't getting quite as hot when they're not under the light. And, that UV loss, even when it isn't degradation, is very real. And when you think about the product on the shelf, the time that has lapsed in between when that test was done and today matters a lot, and that's one thing that I think is easy to overlook because that product is new to you when you go in and buy it.
Right.
But, especially in a state like California, it's passed through 2 layers of licenses before it gets to you at a minimum. And even if those are within the same company under the same roof, that could be a month's old product, in which case, the previously volatile aromatics on that COA may not be there anymore, or they may have changed. And, the representative sample aspect of things is tricky too. But I think the freshness of a product is really what matters the most when I think about some of those COAs. And this is especially true when it comes to your mushrooms, because we have compounds that are sensitive to UV, they're sensitive to moisture, they're sensitive to oxygen. So their ability to break down is rapid. And so, my test result from a month ago may not mean anything compared to a test result, from last week. And so, that shelf life is really important. When we go buy a loaf of bread, like if it's not going to expire for 2 months, that's some weird bread, I want to look at, what's fresh and what's available. I think that, expiration dates in our industry have been kind of like just a thing that we say, we just put like a year from now or what, just like longer away than we think it'll take us to sell it is what an expiration date is. But a lot of it isn't really backed up with has this profile changed, since we packaged it, since we tested, and after how much time, because that use by date really should reflect continuity. But, anyone who's ever bought a pre-roll knows that if the terpene test results on my pre-roll match the terpene test results on the pre-packed eighth and match the terpene test results on the open jar that they're weighing out ounces for me in, there's just no chance, and ultimately the batch test that came out was supposed to be representative of all those products, but it just isn't, Yeah. And that part is kind of tough to illustrate to consumers because you're rarely looking at all 3 of those at the same time. And so you kind of get a piece of data that's, it's kind of like, saying this is peach ice cream. Like that could mean a lot of different flavors in your mouth. And, it's going to point you in a direction, but the freshness of that COA and the freshness of that product is so important before you even get into, the breakdown.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
seems
100%.
like with regulation that it takes a lot longer for products to get to market than they used to be back in medical days. Like Prop 215 in California, you just chop down, take your suitcase to the dispensary, they bought it there, it's on the shelf like the next day. And now it's going through so many processes before it can even get to the shelf and get to the consumer. You mentioned about with the mushrooms, their shelf life. What is that? I have no clue I have mushrooms from, at least 3 months old. I'm like, how long is my mushroom?
Eat them now, eat them immediately, quick, hurry. No, it has a lot to do with storage. Just like I said, there's so many opportunities for degradation for mushrooms. The outside casing of the mushroom, all of that chitin is really like the best defense that it's got. As soon as you harvest it and, you've broken that initial skin, that degradation begins, and so all we can ever do is slow it down. So, being able to dry it quickly and thoroughly is, I think, the first most important thing, which, same for cannabis, right? Like you need to get that first initial dry and cure correct because everything that comes after that, is dependent upon that, that first moisture removal process. And if you leave too much moisture in, the degradation is rampant, and you're going to get dark blue mushrooms, and they're going to get hard and woody pretty quickly because the sugars in them start breaking down. If you over dry them too quickly, then you might end up similarly oxidizing them depending on your drying method. And so, that original drying method really tells you like where you're starting, like if there's a fixed, race of, from 1 to 0, you might be starting further along based on a poor drying. And then from there, it's all storage. And so you want to be airtight. You want to be in the dark. You want to not be exposed to moisture. And you don't want fluctuations in temperature because that can create moisture even inside of a closed container, as, that mushroom can sweat. And that hygroscopic nature, like it's really going to draw in moisture if you dry it properly. So like freeze-dried mushrooms, for example, retain most of their potency, but you have to keep them perfectly sealed and stored at all times because they will get like wet in your hand if it's a little humid outside, and so that, it solves one problem and gives you a different one over here, and so it's a lot like, kind of like a properly cured cannabis. It can tolerate a little bit more variation after it's sort of established its own homeostasis. But with mushrooms, they're just so much more susceptible to that moisture content that I haven't found a good sweet spot other than keeping them sealed. And then I spray everything with argon. And so that's going to displace the air inside the container.
Okay.
This works great for cannabis, works great for your concentrates. I highly recommend it if you ever have to like say you're going to a festival or something, like, you're going into the heat, you're going camping, that you're going to expose your hash to like some less than ideal conditions. Filling your jar with argon. This is actually like made for wine. So if you like wine, it's good for that too. But but yeah, you just displace all the oxygen. And that's really it. It's like to reduce oxidation caused by moisture, get rid of the moisture. To reduce oxidation that's caused by oxygen, get rid of the oxygen. To reduce, degradation caused by UV, keep it in the dark. Like all we can do is kind of block it. It's all defensive.
You're using argon, huh? That's really awesome. So like I know like in cannabis, like we have a specific profile of compounds that we're trying to preserve and stuff. But when it comes to like mushrooms, the only thing that I know about is just like psilocybin, right? So I'm sure that there's a diversity of compounds that we're going to be going after. And I know there's different strains that have different physiological effects on the body and on the mind and stuff. What are some of these other compounds that are going to be degradating that we want to preserve?
So some of the tryptamines that you'll find kind of similar to like your panel of cannabinoids, some of the tryptamines that people are testing for now are precursors to, your psilocybin or to your psilocin. And then others are going to be degradation compounds. And so you're going to see things like baeocystin, which is produced first along the road to psilocybin. You're going to see things like norpsilocin, which are degradation byproducts. And so, that's kind of similar to the types of diversity that you'd see in cannabinoids, where they're all similar structures. Some of them are just going to fit more perfectly into a serotonin receptor than another. And some of them, are being produced during the life cycle of that mushroom, and some of them are being produced or increased based on what I am doing to it, once I've harvested it or handled it. But outside of that, like all mushrooms contain all 9 amino acids, like they are full of highly bioavailable sugars and, carbohydrates that are super healthy for you. The cubensis mushrooms have so much less of that than a lot of the others. You make a trade, which I think is the key when we think about the flavor profile for any of these natural products. Like if we expand the THC, the pie is still a pie. So if I make this piece bigger, another piece gets, smaller. And so, we trade, some of the other like valuable compounds like adenosine or like cordycepin or, some of the compounds found in, Ganoderma that are extremely, medicinal, beneficial to humans. Some of them are going to support your immune system. So that's your adaptogens, which means they're just very good for stress. They're good for, helping you regenerate cells. So like lion's mane is one that's very popular for that, because some of the haricinones and aurinosines are all going to support that, nerve development in your brain. And so it's like
haricinones and
haricinones and auricinines.
Okay.
And then you've got the ergos. So like there's ergothiamine, ergothioneine, all of those ergo drugs. You'll see those like in capsules at, in the nutritional supplement section of every store, because those are all, purported to help support, all of that, neural regeneration and potentially like fight and prevent Alzheimer's. And so they're just vitamins, like they're just nutritionally good for you. But when you think about, pairing those healthy things with the psychoactive things, it's really important. If you smoke weed all day and don't get enough vitamin C, like your inflammation won't go away. Like you still will be on, like we've got to get a little bit of everything together.
Right.
And that's going to be different person to person, which is just fine, because there are as many different mushrooms as there are different people, probably. You've got a lot of choices. But, what's cool about it is that there's interactions in between all of those compounds. And so, in the same way that like enzymes are encouraging the production of flavonoids inside of a trichome, you've got enzymes inside of this mycelium that's encouraging the production of some of these fatty acids. And some of these fatty acids preserve the alkaloids. And so figuring out, how they work together in the mushroom is really important. Even if that fatty acid isn't going to help me with my psilocybin, if it keeps more psilocybin in that mushroom, that's helpful to me, So all of these things are, kind of important, maybe for different reasons. Having more norpsilocin might give you a more intense trip, but having more baeocystin might be indicative of having less of a certain enzyme that, would have caused and led to, some degradation down the line. So it's like, it's such a web, to say any one thing is like one word in a sentence. It's just not quite a whole idea yet.
Right. Yeah, totally. So I mean, like with cannabis, like the soil composition and like different nutrient profiles that we deliver to them are going to affect the end result pretty drastically. But from what I understand about mushroom cultivation is it's a lot of the time just very sterile. Use a particular substrate. Is the substrate going to affect like the end result and profile of compounds in the mushroom?
I mean, it has to, right? Like the idea that we've handled all of these mushrooms under these sterile circumstances really doesn't have anything to do with what the mushroom needs to grow. What it has to do with is removing contamination, because mushrooms and fungus of all kinds grow. They grow so well and so easily and so quickly that your ability to grow a single type of fungus at a time, that's the part that's difficult. And so in order to isolate it, it's not like one seed, one plant, like one spore, you can't get a one spore. That's not a thing. Your one spore is going to be in the air and space with so many others. And so, to be able to, cultivate one type of fungus in a controlled setting requires that level of sterility. But, if you look at like natural turkey tail or reishi farms in the forest, like they're just inoculated logs laid out and they're interacting with the world around them. Some of these wood eaters, like they need the decomposing flesh of a tree to do what they got to do. And you could try to grow it on grain, but I am sure that there's just got to be a chemical difference at some level. And whether that's happening, based on like a lack of or overproduction of specific enzymes that then lead to other chemical outcomes, or if it's just shape, size, speed of growth, the moisture content by the time you're harvesting, like there's so many factors, just like cannabis. It's crazy to think that there isn't an impact. The problem is just that if we only test psilocybin, like that's the last stop on the train. And so like to work backwards from there to decide what to do differently is the longest road, rather than starting with like, what are the first indications of something going well versus something going awry.
100%. So, like, are you familiar with endophytes?
Endophytes? No, tell me.
No, okay. So an endophyte is a bacteria that is integrated into the cell of a plant. It can be consumed entirely through the root system and integrated into the cells. It can be applied and integrated into the cells. But it's a bacteria that lives within the cell of a plant, and it can provide a bunch of different functions, like phytohormones that then lead to different, metabolic pathway stimulation, flavonoid pathway stimulation, and stuff like that. Do you know if anything like that exists in the mushroom world?
Absolutely. Most mushrooms like exist based on bacterial symbiosis. Their entire existence is dependent upon another organism. A lot of fungus is not producing fruiting bodies above the ground, and it's just keeping everything alive underneath us.
So let me be more clear. Sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but I feel like I didn't word my question properly. So like, yeah, fungal hyphae like definitely encompass bacteria, right? And they're full of bacteria and different hyphal, whatever, spores, oospores, whatever. They're full of bacteria. But I guess what I was specifically wondering is, like, in plants, bacteria can be used as, like, in symbiosis, like they use it as a new part to like produce, like, a new part of the cell to produce specific compounds that affect the functionality of like the plant itself. Do you know if like that bacteria can synergize with mushroom cells to like stimulate specific processes in like fruiting bodies?
There definitely are bacteria that are like, exclusively responsible for and a lot of times it's like almost electrical type of signaling between mycelial networks. I don't know of any that are going to relate specifically to cubensis, probably in part because we grow it under such sterile conditions all of the time. So you'd have to go find a cow field to get a proper example of a naturally occurring one. Because most of the time what we look at is, contamination. And we disregard those so quickly. And I think that's the tricky part, is that because fungi are also replicating themselves asexually, your ability to reproduce, like it's the, the original chicken or the egg is, what came first, fungi or bacteria, because both of them could survive in space and crash on this planet on a meteorite. So which came first? And there's no way to answer it, because most of these fungi and bacteria don't exist without each other. And so, a lot of that contributes to, for example, like creating like a vapor environment around itself, where you've got, a condition underneath the soil that's going to repel the bad bacteria or the other things that they want to deter and keep away from the sensitive little homes that they've cultivated. But when we look at some of the stuff that we are doing inside of plastic bags, inside of plastic tubs, inside of our plastic homes. We're going out of our way to keep everything so absolutely sterile that, we probably are missing out on, some of those potential advantages. I know that that's one thing that I worry about with like the mass cultivation of some of the functional mushrooms, is that, we don't necessarily know which compounds we need to test for to evaluate, is this a quality cut, and even if we did, I don't trust us to have the best judgment, because, when we were able to test for cannabinoids, we went crazy testing for cannabinoids. And now it's THC, THC, THC. So, I want to say test for everything that you can, but then it's really hard to prioritize, because some of these, are going to come with a trade-off, right? Like if there's a bacteria that's going to support, the fatty acid and protein production of another mushroom, that's super important. Like we need more and better clean sources of vitamin D to be able to take, as supplements, especially to fight all of the screens and the blue light and everything else, that's going on in this world. But, if we don't know what we're looking for, it's going to be so hard to figure out where we've made that turn, which is really tricky. And when you're dealing with it on this microscopic level, things change fast. So
yeah.
you got to test it a lot and at the right time, you know, and hopefully have enough time between that test and that, you know, getting that data back to react to it in any, you know, productive way. The good news is that mushrooms grow so much faster than cannabis. So you really could just syringe another bag and try again. But, you know, it's still that same level of trial and error because there's just so much about, you know, how fungus works fundamentally, you know, like how nutrients move through it that we don't have any good explanation of yet. You know, we're looking at observations from the finish line backwards, which is a tough way to explain anything.
100%. Yeah, that's so fucking cool. That's awesome that you're doing all this stuff, Murphy. That's so rad.
It's fun because cannabis had gotten it, you know, it was turning into a bit of an echo chamber, and especially once COVID hit, I was like, oof, you know, been doing the same thing over and over, and now that I have to look at it all on a screen instead of in the presence of other people with, you know, it's almost like I couldn't try enough different weed for that like period of 6 months there that I lost enthusiasm for it, and so it got stale on me. And so I'm like so excited to have something to get passionate about again, because it does make me feel like I did when I was like 23 and like made a new consistency of hash that I'd never made before. You know what I mean? Like I get to do really new things all of the time, which is a luxury that I do not take for granted.
Yeah, you seem like you're really in, like last night when I was watching your live, Murphy had a live last night, and you were crunching up your, what were they, cordyceps? It was a cordyceps extract. Yeah, you seem like you're like really enjoying it. You're like, yes, like, this is
it's so
cool.
Yeah.
Like, playing, you know, doing all this stuff and doing science and research and everything. So do you have your own lab now? What's your story? Are you working for someone? Are you just doing education and research on your own?
Yeah, a little bit of everything. I've been, you know, kind of consulting all along, but, you know, again, like COVID kind of switched up the schedule because I was doing a lot of in-person classes before that. And then once COVID hit, I started doing a bunch of webinars and online stuff, which was great to be able to do. But I got pretty burned out on like just my own face,
Right?
On the screen every day. You know, like it's hard to be authentic by myself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you know, right after it was, you know, cool to go out again, I started trying to get back into the in-person classes, but there was kind of a lull in the industry, so I started you know, playing around with more of the psychedelic stuff, and which has been awesome. But then that took me right out of the legal lab because, you know, we've got an HPLC and a GC MS over at Sano Gardens at, you know, my licensed medical rec lab, but I can't bring mushrooms in there. So, you know, so I had to split it up. So I'm a co-owner in that lab. But then I've got a separate little research lab for mushrooms. And, you know, we're learning what we can and figuring out what to do next. The rules for like mushroom distribution and testing are going to be established probably sometime in the, you know, maybe by the end of the year, but probably early spring in Colorado. And so once that plays out, I'll figure out if I'm going to take my HPLC into a, you know, registered commercial address and pay money to the DOR again, or, you know, or if we'll keep it at home. But one thing that I am really excited about is that, you know, the language in the current draft is protective of allowing home growers to be able to have access to the licensed labs to get their stuff tested, which is something that is like so obvious, but we missed it with cannabis. We just completely missed it. And even today, if you grow cannabis, you can't go get it tested easily because you have to go to not the licensed labs. You have to go to somebody else. And it's like, how can you compare then? You know, like I want to compare this dispensary's weed versus the same strain that I grew. And, you know, to do that without the access to the same quality and types of labs and equipment is crazy. So, you know, we've been able to so far preserve that in Colorado for mushroom growers, which I think will be really important for keeping the mushroom industry kind of contained and small batch, because we need that evidence. When a home grower can demonstrate the level of consistency and purity that anyone else in a commercial location does using that same testing, like I think we'll be able to upfront eliminate the myths of like the black market weed is untested, it's contaminated with whatever, and we'll just be able to like just cut that out right from the start and just say, because what we all know is that the small grows do it better. Like what we, like, well, not all of them, but if we were to compare all of the commercial versus all of the like, craft, like you just are you're gonna see such a different trend in that, the size. And I think from an innovation perspective, like we need both, we need the mass produced product for research, for consistency, for the mass consumer that probably doesn't need a really powerful experience, because they probably are just like going to Red Rocks and they'll be all right,
Yeah. Bud Light,
Yeah, exactly. But we don't get innovation out of those environments. We get innovation out of small batches. We get innovation out of someone accidentally doing something wrong, learning something new.
Yeah.
And that's where like access to testing for the small grows will be huge. So I hope that that's where I will get to kind of live for a while, because there's really not a place in the current legal adult use system to do cannabis research. Like the people who are doing cannabis research are either like doing medical clinical research, which is just such a different thing, that does rely on that highly consistent, super simplified, product. But there should be a way to make your living researching, the way to grow, researching, like I always say, the living soil guys love to talk about their microbes, but I'm like, tell me which flavonoids you're producing because of those microbes.
We don't know.
Because, of course not. But in the same way that you figured out what microbes, you could figure out what flavonoids. It's just that, everyone looks
we don't have
this one piece of the process, and so,
find me a, chromatograph. Give me something.
Right. Well, here's the thing is we could innovate cheaper ways to do it, right? Like, the fact that we can take like a little speck of white powder and find out if there's fentanyl in it or not. Like if we wanted to, we could in a very real way. It's just got to come from the demand. If the state thought that it was critically important to know which flavonoids were in that cannabis, it would be done.
Sure,
and it would be affordable,
Right.
And so it's got to come from the ground up. And I think keeping things a little bit smaller initially in the mushroom world will really support that,
Cool. Fuck yeah.
So
At least I hope.
my question is for mushroom cultivation, with the testing that you're doing, are you seeing, because I've been hearing rumors about like adding nitrogen in either like ammonium phosphate, or some people are doing like neem, or just sterilizing their substrate with a nitrogen source. What is that?
I mean, so nitrogen's a nutrient, right? And a critical one, especially for some of like the simplest processes, inside of that fungus for it to metabolize things. So, I think that there's probably some value in sort of kind of breaking up that substrate, because, the standard sterilization is just like substrate in a bag, water, boil the hell out of it. Right. And so like that will kill stuff. But then, the next question is like, okay, but how does the mycelium penetrate throughout that substrate in an efficient way? Like if you were growing in a pot, but your plant always grew in only one side of the pot, like that's no good. You got to figure out why the root system can't expand in a more homogeneous way, because it'll lead to more problems down the line. And so I think that, potentially introducing more nitrogen up front can help kind of create some space inside of that substrate, where just boiling water and compacting things in these plastic bags may not be as representative of the way that mycelium would show up out in the world, in regular soil or the stump of a tree or whatever. But outside of that, again, like I said, a lot of people aren't able to, it just comes down to like what you use to measure the efficacy of that. And so, it's funny that we all complain about like everyone brags about THC now, but remember when everyone only bragged about 3-alite? Like, we got to brag about something. We only know how to brag about the one thing we're doing, And so, like, we'll only replace that with something new as we go along. And I think, similarly, a lot of mushrooms, like when I look at the bags out there, people are advertising how quickly it'll fruit and how much weight you're going to produce out of it. And so, weight does not equal potency, does not equal chemical diversity, does not equal shelf life, does not equal ease of growing, there's all these different factors to keep in mind. But if weight is what we're asking for, then that's what we'll get. And similarly, when we stop thinking about the weight per tub versus the weight per bag, we'll start looking at the potency per tub and the potency per bag. And, and that's as far as we've gotten with cannabis. So like whatever comes next, let's just, hurry up and find out, put it on the list. Because a lot of those different additives, it's like, some of them are troubleshooting additives to make sure that you are, eliminating, the potential for contamination to show up later. And, in doing that, you can take advantage of, greater surface area and not worry so much about an external contamination. In other circumstances, like a lot of people are kind of mixing substrate now too, which gets really complicated, and this is where it gets right out of my level of expertise, because when we talk about adding nitrogen to a grain only substrate versus someone who's doing inoculated grain and a soil mix, or like all of these different combinations, now you have like the interactive, you got the whole family.
Yeah, that's a huge network of compounds that are interacting with each other.
Right. And so some of those, like the phosphate you were mentioning, if I'm bringing soil into the mix, it's probably important to control some of what's going on in that soil, which may be more about the soil supporting the mushroom. And so I'm supporting the soil with this additive so that the soil can support the mushroom, but maybe my additive isn't having a direct measurable impact on the fruit, or maybe it is and we aren't measuring. There's so little data, and most of the data right now is kind of about weight.
Okay.
Which, makes sense. Like it's what, measure something. If that's all you've got is a scale, great. I'll take whatever numbers I can get. But it's something that it's going to take more time and repetition, to figure out.
Okay. Well, I have another question for you. When you were talking about basically stacking like adaptogens and vitamins and different compounds with your psilocybin, what are your thoughts on the Stamets stack with the lion's mane and the niacin with the psilocybin?
So lion's mane is a really tricky mushroom because it's one of the few examples of a fungus where you have compounds that are produced by the mycelium that aren't also in the fruiting body. And usually what you find in the mycelium is found in, slightly greater concentration by weight in the fruiting body. But lion's mane does have compounds that are only in the mycelium. And, these are all, neuroregenerative compounds, which is really important when you think about, kind of the concept of what a psychedelic experience can do for you, because some of it is about, and I think, the therapeutic aspect of it is really about kind of breaking connections, whether they're like weak connections between, different synapses or, just bad habits that we're kind of breaking behaviorally. And so when you break some of those connections, having a regenerative compound in there to help support your brain after that trauma technically is really valuable. It's kind of like staying hydrated when you're drinking, right? Like you've got to, if you take from here, you've got to compensate over here. And so that's going to be really valuable, especially if you're trying to take them every day, for example, because if you're microdosing every day, there is a cost to every, chemical that goes in. Something, reacts and goes out. And so to support that and kind of bring yourself back to a level of homeostasis every time is really valuable. The niacin part is a little tricky because I think, I don't know if you guys ever did like the take too much niacin to pass a drug test when you were a child, right?
Yeah, a few times.
So having experienced that, don't recommend it. But that one is one that like you can OD on niacin. You can take way too much of that. And so that's one that's a little bit tricky. Like you need to use as directed there, because if you want a more intense psychedelic trip, you can't just take more of a product that contains a bunch of niacin in it. You are going to push yourself over a threshold. And so for the purpose of like cleansing your body and your blood of the leftovers from whatever you took, and supporting it with the vitamins, the brain vitamins to rebuild connections afterwards is a really good approach to it. It's just, it does require you to follow directions, which is a big ask of people taking mushrooms, And so, I think that there's probably a lot of value in that. It's just going to be on a case by case basis, because what's tricky there is that now that, that psilocybin quantity needs to be the correct dose for you. And so, you've got to scale all of those things together, which is still quite personal until we know what all of the interactions might be.
Okay, interesting. So with the lion's mane, what compound is in the mycelium that's not in the fruiting body?
I want to say it's the auricinones are in the mycelium only. And it's just rare that that's the case, because a lot of times, the mushrooms are just kind of an extension of the mycelium that, is just for spore production almost. So it's kind of just like a little more of what's underground. But that's one of the few instances that I've ever heard of where we've got a bioavailable chemical that is not found in the fruiting body. And I suspect that probably has something to do with some of the other fatty acids that are abundant in lion's mane, because lion's mane has just a lot of nutritional value, which is pretty neat, like all 9 amino acids in one location is kind of crazy. And, that's mushrooms. Like they just are made of the building blocks of all of our lives.
That's wild.
You talk about like the nine that like the body uses, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the 9 that are essential. And so, it's so weird that, like you could pursue a really complicated diet to make sure that you are keeping up with all of those amino acids for health. But also it's like any given mushroom just has them right there for you. It's too convenient. It's a little suspicious.
A little suspicious.
I've completely cut out coffee, and I only do the lion's mane, lattes every morning, chaga, reishi. I'm all about it. I have like gummies. I'm just like in it with the mushrooms and just helping my health. So I was always under the impression that the fruiting body was better than the mycelium. Like in some of those lattes, like I know some of them will be like only fruiting body and some of them will be like grain and mycelium based. So do you think that there is one that's better than the other?
So it's just so hard to compare them, because when someone, like when a product is, made from mycelium, they're not like taking tweezers and harvesting hyphae, right? Like they're grinding up whatever that mycelium has, wrapped itself around. And so by weight, all that mycelium comes with all of that grain or whatever substrate it was grown on. And so, if we're talking about a very sterile, grown in a dish type of mycelium, then we might be, avoiding all of that extra grain content. But we could potentially also be losing other compounds that are supported by the nutrition that grain provides. It's just so hard for me to think that changing something at that level doesn't change everything else somewhere over here, But so, when you think of it in that context, like a fruiting body, 1 gram of that versus 1 gram of mycelium and grain, it's just such an inherently different product by weight, because even if the concentration in the mycelium little pieces were to be higher, it's completely diluted by the substrate that comes with it. And so, I think at minimum, the price should reflect that. Fruiting bodies take longer to grow. They take more investment to grow. They take more investment to, harvest to dry and everything else that comes with that. So the cost should reflect the shortcut that is the mycelium product. That being said, one of the reasons that you can switch from coffee to the mushroom products instead is because a lot of the compounds in your coffee that worked for you are in mushrooms. Theobromine is in all of your coffee. It's a huge support to the caffeine in the coffee. It's the energy without the crash in your coffee. It's in really high quantities in espresso, for example. And so, that theobromine's in the mushrooms too. Some of these other compounds are also there. And you can kind of tell when you smell like a reishi extract or a chaga extract, it smells like your coffee. It's the same molecule giving the coffee and those mushrooms that smell. And so, all you've done is, not necessarily replaced coffee, but found a product that gave you some of the goods, without some of the bads, because, to get that theobromine without the intense acidity of, that caffeinated coffee bean is hugely valuable. And what's wild about these coffee beans is a lot of them rely on fungi to grow in the first place. So I couldn't even tell you if it's the coffee or if it's the mushrooms that grow with the coffee that are putting that product there. Ergothiamine used to be in every single thing we ate because the ground was myceliated all over the planet. And so every plant that we ate would have had ergothioneine in it. Every animal that ate plants would have had ergothioneine in it. And so the further away we get from myceliated soil, the less of those compounds we have, in these second and third, party sources. But a lot of those compounds are not necessarily unique to mushrooms. They just are all in mushrooms, just a nice bucket, which is really, like I said, it's too coincidental, it's,
What do you?
it's exciting, but it's a little bit magic.
Coincidental. What are you implying? What do you think it is?
I mean, I think it's a good demonstration of how, like, we probably genuinely need mushrooms. Like I would call it a food group almost, like if you don't have any mushrooms in your life, the reason you're alive is because of your third party, access to the compounds that mushrooms produced. You just are getting your mushrooms through a plant or through an animal that you've eaten. But I think, the fact that almost every, nutritional compound we need to sustain our lives besides the water is in a fungus somewhere is just very, very significant. There's a really important framework there. And it's something that, anyone who's growing living soil can see. I think if you're growing living soil for cannabis, put some cubensis in that soil. Let's find out, because I feel like both inherently get better, right? It's got to be.
The trichoderma just outcompetes, man. I have consumed 2 monotubs in the last few months. I have so much trichoderma around. I don't know if I put some of my spores, my tubs, and I just put it in the living soil bed, but nothing's
happening. It's a competitive environment in there.
My sister-in-law believes that mushrooms are God. Like, that is the God, like, compound of the world is mushrooms, that is how all life has started. That is how, we're talking about all of these compounds that are necessary for life. The evolution of plants, 90% of them have a relationship with some type of mycorrhizal fungi. Most plants are communicating with each other with this fungal relationship. I mean, travel through time and space, art, language, religion, all of these things stem from fungus. And so it's like, well, what really is God if not the fungus among us?
Right. Well, and in the sense that, like, a significant part of our physical human body mass is bacteria and microbial little creatures, thriving in us. Like, we are fungi as well, and so, it makes a lot of sense to me. Like I said, like you can go the mystical route and see it as God, but if you believe the Big Bang Theory, like a meteorite, or a comet, covered in ice, hitting this planet, like all it has to deliver is a couple bacteria and a couple spores, and we have life, so it's just, like I said, a little too coincidental, like I don't know if there are aliens so much as there are fungus, around us, and they needed us for something, I guess, because we rely on them in such interconnected ways that are so obvious in a way that, like, it has taken us longer to learn with a lot of other things, like we had to ruin our soil across the planet to figure out that we were doing it wrong. But
Right.
with fungus, if you've got trike, it'll tell you quick. You get to fail fast. You get to Silicon Valley this this process.
Nice.
It looks like we have some questions. Do you guys want to move to questions from the
Yeah,
chat?
definitely.
How long you want to set aside for this, Murphy? What are you thinking?
I'm pretty flexible, so
You're flexible? Okay.
yeah.
I'm pretty low on energy. I do remember you wanted to talk about enzymes for a bit at one point.
Well,
but
my big question was, have you looked at, flavonoids based on your different blends of, all of your
like
all of your
microbe
teas and
populations
everything?
and stuff like that.
Yeah, because
So
the enzyme interactions are so interesting, and the microbes affect that in a way that I don't think we've really paid close enough attention to.
mhm.
Because
So
we look at it at the wrong end,
just like how you were saying earlier, there's so many different factors at play when it comes to soil and living soil. With enzymes and amino acids, carbohydrates, your different fats, and there's so many different things that, for me, when my approach to it is just to include all of it, right? To create to create a thriving ecosystem with a diversity of different compounds, different polysaccharide sources, beta glucans, starch, from algae, from everything, from bacteria, chitin, so on, right? And let the plant communicate through like root exudates to then take up whatever it wants to kind of maximize like the genetic potential of the plant. As far as like introducing specific enzymes to outcome in specific like terpenes or flavonoids, I don't think that that's really how it works. And I think almost by like intentionally pumping one single compound, you're going to throw things out of balance. A lot of the time, I think it's better to just let the soil figure it out. And there's people have like this innate urge to constantly like control things and like want to induce this particular thing. I say support the biology and let the ecosystem do it. And then like it's gonna figure out what's best, and it can express itself differently in a bunch of different ways. But as far as like a specific compound resulting in a specific terpene, or a specific microbe that secretes a specific phytohormone or a specific compound that then results in a specific terpene, I just don't think that that's how it works. It's more of just like giving the plant everything it needs to be able to, to express itself.
Right. And then you're kind of relying on the genetics of that plant for its inclination to produce one flavor versus another. Because I always think about like in the hydro days where you buy the purple juice to make it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and sure, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that you can do that, but I bet it's at the expense of something else, right? And
Right.
we've had like similar conversations like this with different consultants that have come on here, and how like you can pump a plant full of immediately available forms of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium, whatever, that aren't specifically in those forms in the soil, and you're going to result in like a huge THC number. But if you have different profiles of those same elements, because there's different forms of nitrate, phosphate, phosphorus, whatever. I think that it influences the plant in different ways, right? And it allows the plant to express itself differently. And like when you allow for diversity of amino acids, because amino acids act as phytohormones, they have different physiological effects on plants, and I'm sure that they do on mushrooms too. So if you leave it there and let like the root exudates and the biology balance itself out for like your specific topographical location, and like your climate and your environment, you're going to find a balance, and then you're going to have a product unique to the climate and environment that you're in that can't be mimicked. But like forcing that to happen, I think you're just inevitably going to create an imbalance or have some weird fluctuation or some unpredictable outcome. So for me, it's just feed biology, introduce biology, let it kind of settle, and like take care of itself. But there was like, sorry, I'm like super ranting right now, but there was this this one time I posted this article, and it was talking about specific species of bacteria that communicated to other species of bacteria through terpenes. Terpenes are essentially the language of the planet, right? That's how plants communicate to each other. It's how bacteria, insects, everything communicates to each other through terpenes, and we communicate through terpenes too. Like we smell death and we're like, oh fuck, it's death, like don't go over there, it's death. So I posted this article about specific bacteria that resulted in specific that use specific terpenes to communicate to each other, and posted it in like the cannabis community, like talking about like look how interesting this is, and everyone's like, oh my god, Luna figured out that you can introduce specific species of bacteria.
You invented it.
in cannabis and stuff, and I had people hitting me up like, oh my god, like how do you get like this specific species so I can have more myrcene or more limonene, whatever. Like I see that this species produce limonene, like how much do I have to add? And I'm like, no, that's not, I didn't say that at all. Like that's not how it works. And there was like this huge thing that went around where people are talking about you use this specific bacteria and it produces this specific thing, and it's not
right
what I meant. And so
to a point of what you're saying though, is that if we had more testing, that we could see what enzymes are being produced specifically by like the terpenes that are being produced by the plant that are then calling in the bacteria because there's a specific pest or pathogen that's coming. So then they're creating this enzyme that's then having a feedback loop that's then creating another terpene because it's like, hey, I'm going to ward off the pest. And so you can like increase different terpenes through enzymes, but the testing and like how do we really know like that would just be insane to be able to figure that out.
Well, that's why it's so interesting. And I think now that you told that story, I think it is probably your fault that I have these enzyme questions now, because because by the time the question came to me, it wasn't about the bacteria anymore of what you were adding. It was about the enzymes, because within the trichome, enzymes are catalysts to trigger production of whatever they're going to start producing. And so, the lack of presence of certain enzymes, equals the lack of certain compounds within, that trichome. And so when I think about like the way that we bred, the hemp plants to produce less THC, where there's going to be a difference in enzymes within that product. And, anything that I could look at earlier in the cycle is really helpful. And what I'm hearing right now is that I've got to go all the way back to bacteria, but then I still would have to measure both at every step. If I knew how much bacteria went in and then how many enzymes were produced, I might be able to create an equation there that could lead to chemical production C over here. But, the repeatability of that is on the level of one plant at a time, one trichome at a time. I don't even,
Yeah, how are you going to do that? And I think even you have to go back further to like amino acids,
Right.
And
which
then it's
isn't
just
helpful. Now that's tiny and hard to,
now it's tiny. And
look at.
how do you do it? I mean, I don't know how to do it. And a lot of the things that I try to do are all speculative and anecdotal, with like a scientific understanding of how it works. But most of the time, it's like I don't fucking know.
Yeah, I always like a solution where I
Um,
can do like a color stain or something that's, qualitative, but, accessible. That's why I love my microscope. It's like anything I can learn by looking at it. How convenient. But then, it doesn't always explain anything, it's an observation and not an explanation.
Looks like we have a question posted up from Chad Westport. So he's saying, as we passed the amanitas, we both wondered, are people extracting that? How many doses would come from the average sized mushroom? Is it small percentage similar to CBD in type 1 cannabis?
It is even smaller than that. You've got, if we're talking about like just psilocybin / psilocin. So one thing, if someone doesn't already understand this, is that psilocybin is the prodrug. Psilocin is the one that you're having a psychedelic experience from. So psilocin is created, based on dephosphorylating the psilocybin. And so the acidity of your stomach acid can do that. That's why lemon tech tends to hit a little bit harder, because you're using the acidity of the lemon to help break down the chitin, for starters, and also, lose that phosphate group from the psilocybin to become psilocin. And so psilocin is very similar to serotonin in structure, and therefore fits into the receptor and can, give you a serotonin-like experience. But we're talking about very tiny quantities. You're seeing like an average mushroom, we're talking 1%, 2% maybe. And it's so hard to say average, especially now, because, like penis envies have become the average. I feel like they're everywhere now, where, for a long time it was like long, skinny Cambodians and, like just different mushrooms. And so, comparing those genetics to each other, I think the differences amongst those genetics are a lot more dramatic, kind of like cannabis probably used to be before we crossbred it to the point of near homogeneity in terms of the cannabinoids. So we may see that happen with mushrooms too, although we don't get to breed mushrooms quite the same way, because it's fungus and it doesn't need us to reproduce itself. But it's very small quantities generally. And then, once you get up into, those whole numbers, you still aren't quite experiencing that when you consume it, because there's a lot of loss and degradation over time. There's a lot of loss and degradation in that drying and storage process. And so something that started out at 2% 3 months ago, if it's been sitting in a jar at 12% humidity, with oxygen in it, it's probably losing a little bit until it kind of equalizes with the amount of, oxidizing factors in its environment. And then it might hold steady for a little while, but their shelf life is so short. And so that original number is so difficult to use. And, when we're talking about like a dose for someone, it's kind of like that 5 milligram dose of THC. For some people, absolutely 5 milligrams is their dose. And for some people, they have to eat 50 milligrams to get 5 milligrams into their blood. And so, everyone has a different number of serotonin receptors. And generally, you're going to have more serotonin receptors in your stomach than anywhere else in your body. But what if you have IBS? What if you have Crohn's? What if you had fettuccine Alfredo every day for the past week? You know what I mean? Like what if you're my dad and you drink like a gallon of whole milk every day? Like everyone's stomach is so different that, the abundance of those receptors doesn't necessarily make them more available for absorbing that drug. And so, you have to be able to optimize those two things at once. And so it's still quite personal. And I think similarly to, those cannabis edibles, one of the most personal things about it is how quickly you process it. with just, the contents of your stomach alone, that'll make a big difference. That's why, taking them on an empty stomach is going to give you a different experience than a full stomach. It's why I recommend not taking them with a whole bunch of water in your stomach if you just drink a whole bunch of water, because it'll get real bubbly for a little while, which is just not that pleasant. So, there's a lot of factors that take an already low number way down, which is pretty tricky because, I remember in high school, like you just ate an eighth of mushrooms. I don't know why eighths was the number, but we love an eighth of stuff, right? And now most of the mushrooms that I encounter, I don't need an eighth of those mushrooms because they are probably 5 times as potent as the mushrooms that I would have eaten an eighth of, back in the day. And I think in that same question they were asking about Amanita, same type of circumstance. Now that the market for mushrooms exists, Amanita is kind of the CBD of that mushroom market because you get a slightly psychedelic experience, but it's legal, everywhere. But when you're cultivating it, versus foraging it, who knows what other others are in it and how consistent that dose is going to be. Amanitas can be poisonous if you are not careful about, where you're foraging them and, if you're not experienced in that way. So a cultivated Amanita could be safer to avoid some of those, environmental risks from the Amanita, but it doesn't answer the rest of the questions as far as like what other compounds in that mushroom are playing a role in that experience and what your tolerance for that compound over time will be. One of my favorite things about, psilocin as a psychedelic drug is that your body, not only processes it relatively quickly, but it also produces enzymes in response to taking it that make it less effective right afterwards. Like your body says, oh, if you're eating this, I'm going to produce more of this to break it down. And so it kind of has this like anti-addiction buffer built in that, prevents you from being able to get, higher right after you've eaten some, which, is really interesting in the context of like, not having a huge trip for a week straight. But, when I look at those type of impacts with the not psilocybin, not psilocin, I don't know, like we've said several times in several different ways here, it's give and take. So, if I'm producing more of this enzyme to help my body process these other chemicals, what am I not producing while the energy is spent there? Or what is an excess of that enzyme going to do inside my stomach? Is it going to eat up my serotonin as well? Like, am I working backwards or, kind of what does that experience look like? And we just don't have good long-term data for any of it because while we've been using mushrooms for the entire history of humankind, we weren't using them in an additive, kind of pharmaceutical type of way where we're just adding it on top of whatever you do every day, like taking amanitas as a medicine on the same day that you had 2 frappuccinos. Like, I don't know if you can say this is what my ancestors were doing. Like, I don't think, you know what I mean? There's a bit of a disconnect. And so, there's just a lot of other chemicals that we haven't, figured out what is going to happen in your body long-term. So especially with these new, not cubensis, not psilocybin mushroom products, like, mushrooms are inherently good for you. They're full of a lot of good stuff, but I would say like everything in moderation because too much of anything is risky. And mushrooms just happen to be one of those things that kind of stop you from taking too much. But most other compounds are not smarter than us in that way, and they will allow us to abuse them. So we have to be the responsible ones.
Yeah, I've had too many mushrooms, too many times.
Yeah.
Use Bacillus thuringiensis latent flower for caterpillars. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah.
I've done it.
Yep, definitely. Spray that BT. It's soil-dwelling bacteria, and if you have caterpillar damage, you spray and kill those caterpillars. Caterpillars means botrytis, means bud rot, means total loss of harvest. Go ahead, spray them.
Yeah, and what I understand, it's the enzyme that bacteria produces, and it
Yep.
crystallizes the proteins within the cells of those caterpillars.
Yeah.
So
That's pretty gnarly.
it's pretty cool.
Mhm.
There's videos you can watch it happen, and like the poor little caterpillars are like crusting
Yeah,
up.
they just
And
like
they're, like,
solidify like a.
Yeah.
That's pretty sick.
So that's it for questions, ladies. Do you guys want to carry on? Luna, I know you're sick, so
Yeah.
have you had enough?
I am sick. We can keep going. I'll communicate if I'm not doing good. I have had a few little coughing fits here. My throat is getting a little weird, but I'm good. I don't know though. How are you two doing? You got anything else?
I'm good on time. I'll probably roll a little joint. That always helps get us where we're going. I wonder though, when you're sick too, do you notice being in your grow being detrimental when you're already sick, like being exposed to all of those terps and like the richness of the air and all of that? Is the odor too much? Do you get more sensitive to it?
I still get up and like walk around my greenhouse and just like check stuff out. It doesn't really bother me, no. But like I did walk into my breeding tent and there was pollen everywhere, and that bothered me. Yeah. But no, not really. I mean, I've stayed away from doing much work. I've been down in bed for like 10 days.
Oh my gosh.
And I finally went to the urgent care today, and they did a chest x-ray, and they think I have some kind of microbe infection, fungal or bacterial infection in my lungs.
You would,
I know I would, right? For real. Honestly, I think it's from not wearing a mask while top dressing amendments.
Yeah.
So like I wore like a mask when I was mixing my amendments, and then I was like, oh, whatever, I'm just gonna lean back and like do it. But I have like a big soil bed, and I have a whole bunch of beds. And then just like a few days later, I was like, dude, my fucking lungs hurt.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So
that's tough because you probably don't want like a whole lot of airflow over that while you're dealing with it, but at the same time,
no.
Otherwise, you got to lock it down in the face.
Yeah, and I tried to like, because I don't, I do no-till, and so I tried to do it on top of my mulch and then water it in, and so I didn't mix it with something that was gonna like hold the dust down, whatever, like a compost or something, because I wanted it to go like onto the feeder roots of the top of the soil. And the trade-off between like what's going to be best for my plants or what's going to be best for me, I think next time I'll probably do what's going to be best for me. That's
fair. Well,
yeah,
I support you unless it turns out that the weed is bad, in which case I'll take it back.
Well, my weed is never bad. So
yeah, exactly. We'll let you know. I wonder, have you played with ionization at all to help with the dust? I don't know, what the trade-off would be. Just ionizing surfaces. So you can get like fans with ionizing filters, but especially like in the lab, you can get by grounding things, to cut down on static, but then also just like wipes and fans and stuff, you can ionize the air, and that's just going to make it harder for dust to move around.
That's
which is helpful for like when you have to weigh stuff out. You don't want like all the dust floating all around in my scale, because then I'm like really not weighing it, like it's the scale itself is getting heavier with each scoop. And so, it's really helpful with the dust, but I don't know how well that'll react in a living environment.
I think that could work indoor if I turn like all the fans and exhausts and stuff off. Maybe we've had a difficult, it's a cool idea to play with. In my greenhouse, it's just impossible.
Yeah, you're basically just like changing the electrical charge in the air so that it's not sucking that dust to itself. It's not magnetizing the dust to leave where it's at, which for like a pre-roll machine, things like that, super important, because otherwise it's just a nightmare. Also really helpful in like a bakery where you have just like flour everywhere and stuff.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Hey, I had a question. So you were talking about enzymes and acidity to break down, chitin and stuff. Have you ever thought of using chitinase?
Using what? Sorry.
chitinase. I don't know. Maybe that's how you pronounce it.
Chitinase.
Chitinase.
No, is that a similar type
So
of
like chitin's a fibrous polysaccharide, right? And
right.
There's enzyme chitinase that breaks it down.
I mean, so I guess I wonder, just how aggressive it is, because the chitin also is insulating, some of those alkaloids. And
Sure.
so like it's insoluble, which is helpful. But then, then you still have to like filter it back out again. And so like we use like degumming enzymes in cannabis to like break down really waxy, gummy cannabis. And I imagine that the chitinase would react similarly to that, where it, maybe kind of turns it into more of a sludge, a little more of a goo than a crunchy, solid. But then it, you end up with that filtration problem down the line of like, if I can remove a solid from something that's dissolved in a liquid, that's, physically, mechanically pretty straightforward. Removing, separating two liquids from each other, slightly more complicated. And, that gets harder and harder as, they become more sensitive. So, because my biggest fear with a lot of this mushroom stuff is that we don't know what all the things that are active are in order to monitor them, because it's the bluing, that is turning the psilocin blue in the degradation. There's an enzyme, a specific one that triggers that, and it being present in the mushroom doesn't necessarily mean that your psilocin will degrade. But if that's true, then like, what's the one that kickstarts it? Like somebody's the catalyst. Nothing happens for no reason. And so, it would be tricky to kind of see where that breakdown stops. Because one of the things I worry about the most with the mushroom extracts is that there's a lot of fats in them. These fatty acids, and so fats degrade just inherently. That's why rosin doesn't hold its flavor for as long as live resin. They could have the exact same terpenes in them, but a slightly higher fat content means just inherently a slightly shorter shelf life. The fats will break down. And so it's such a trade, because those fats could also be, the antioxidant protectors of the alkaloids. And so, which one is doing which job is so critical. It's like, I always look at it like I can add vitamin E to a psilocybin extract, and that's going to preserve the psilocybin and keep it from degrading into psilocin. But like, if there's, something that could function like vitamin E within that mushroom already, then why do I need to go and bring in this vitamin E? I want to find what's there inside of it. And that's what's so tricky about the cubensis, is that it's already a pretty delicate little mushroom. Like something like a reishi is like tree bark, it's very difficult to break down. And so, a more aggressive, approach is probably relevant there. Whereas with something like a big fluffy, almost cotton candy textured, penis envy mushroom,
Sure,
is a little bit easier to get through. But yeah, there's just so many different interactions in there. It's so tricky.
for sure. It's just a thought. It may be like you.
No, definitely. What I do the most is I just ruin product, and I see what it takes to ruin it. And then I know, then I can write that down.
Yeah, be like,
the thing to not do. Yeah,
really,
if you find my notebook lying around, it's not instructions. Don't do what I did. That's the stuff that doesn't need to be done.
It didn't work. I mean, I've been there a whole bunch of times. I've tried a whole bunch of stuff that was just like, no, that didn't work. Not a good idea. Yep. All right, next.
Yeah, exactly.
Just part of the process.
Yeah, no, fail as much as you can. That's the only way that you get better at anyone. Like everyone who knows the most has failed the most. I think that's where you learn.
Just gotta get
if it's worked out for you every time, good luck, because the failure's coming.
Yeah, I don't think it's never worked out for everyone every time. No way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of times people take like failure seriously though, or personally, right? They're like, oh, it failed, and now I'm a failure. It's like, no, this is just how it goes. It's
right.
just,
the thing to keep in mind is all these interactions, all these different inputs are proof that it's not all your fault, you know? So you should be relieved by that. You know, you can be like, it was those dang bacteria, not me, you know?
The bacteria was there, but still, you know.
Yeah, sure, I brought them in, but you know. Exactly. No, embrace your failures and talk about them more, you know? I think like I have learned more from, you know, seeing stuff go wrong. And I respect people so much more for admitting when things go wrong, because it means they tried something new, you know? If you repeat the same thing every time, it's, again, innovation doesn't happen there.
Definitely.
So, gotta play with stuff. You gotta be willing to fail, be willing to fall down, and get back up. You know,
Right?
Is that Victor?
No, exactly.
Okay, I think I'm gonna, Luna, with your hacking like that, I think I'm gonna cut it off here, and you need to get some more rest. And I think, Alex, you've got a son to take care of, and I know you've got a child too. So,
Yep.
All right. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah. It's so much fun to talk with you guys today. I love it. I never get to sit and talk with growers that much anymore because I'm always in the lab. But you know, the growers
really
in the
appreciate your coming, Murphy.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And as for the chat, guys, you guys are fantastic. You know, I don't know if you guys, ladies, have been watching the chat, but lots of great content coming out. So unless you guys have something else to add, I'm going to cut it off there.
Yeah,
all
that's
good
it for me, you know.
All right.
Okay, guys, then we'll see you on Monday.
All right.
Okay,
Have a good
bye-bye.
weekend. Get well soon.